And so to our final panelist, my co-chair, John Andrews, who's... Are you going to give us the vision thing, John?
Oh, the vision. We'll see. Actually, I wanted to remind you all of that familiar Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And I think, having heard the previous speakers, it's obvious that we are living in interesting times. Let me remind you of some of the reasons for this. The turmoil in Afghanistan, we're talking about southeastern Europe, but let's broaden it a bit. The turmoil in Afghanistan continues 16 years after the American invasion. The turmoil in Iraq continues 14 years after the toppling of Saddam Hussein. The civil war in Syria continues 6 years after the so-called Arab Spring swept from North Africa across to the Middle East. And of course, the anarchic chaos in Libya is now almost 6 years after Muammar al-Gaddafi was toppled. And that, I submit, should be yet another sobering warning that Western military power, whether it's America's or NATO's, can have unforeseen and very damaging consequences. Now, what is the connection between all that and Europe now? Well, it means a tide of migrants seeking refuge from war and from poverty. 1 million crossed the Mediterranean in 2015. An awful lot of them died. Now, last year, a mere 370,000 crossed the Mediterranean, thanks to a rather controversial deal with Turkey. Well, that's one aspect of this. But the other aspect, of course, is the rash of terrorist attacks in the name of the Islamic State's distorted version of Islam. Now, do these phenomena explain the rise of populism and extremism even in Europe? Well, up to a point, perhaps they do. But I submit there are actually more fundamental problems that have undermined popular confidence in Europe as a whole and the European Union in particular. One is the agonizingly slow recovery from the global financial crisis of 2008. Ordinary people saw a decline in their real incomes, but the bankers stayed out of jail and they still kept their bonuses. Another fundamental problem has been the crisis in the Eurozone, where Germany prospers and poor Greece still suffers. Now, put all those factors together, and the reality, I think, for us all now is a crisis of confidence that has led to the Brexit vote in my country, a vote which I personally feel was misguided, although I think you'll hear some other opinions as well. It's led also to extreme nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe, and the possibility that France, a founding member of the European Union, will this coming Sunday choose as its next president Marine Le Pen, who's dedicated to taking France out of the EU. Now, to all that, let's also add the election of Donald Trump in the US, the increasing authoritarianism of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, and the machinations of Vladimir Putin, another of the world's so-called strongmen, in a Russia which I think is determined, for better or for worse, I would argue for worse, to resist the spread of Western liberalism. So we are indeed living in interesting times, catalogued as they now are by so much fake news. Now, the question is obviously what to do about it. I would suggest three things. The first is that we should banish any complacency and recognize the gravity of our situation. Way back in 1989, with the collapse of communism, American political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote an article in the magazine The National Interest. It subsequently became a best-selling book, in which he famously proclaimed the end of history. In other words, this was a triumph of democracy, of capitalism, and of liberal thought. Well, as he now admits, he was wrong. The Russia of Yeltsin was seen as a friend. The Russia of Vladimir Putin is, at best, a rival, and some would argue, an enemy. China is an economic power that is now flexing its military muscles in a way that alarms its Pacific neighbors. Add to that the protectionist instincts of President Trump with his America First policy, always expressed with gestures like this, and it now looks to me as though those Western values of democracy, of capitalism, of liberal thought are being eroded. In which case, if the erosion continues, we could well see the end of what we like to call the West. Now, my second suggestion is to stand up for those values that are being eroded. Our societies benefit from being open to new ideas, to more trade, and to more collaboration. Whatever the folly, to my mind, of Brexit, the UK thankfully says it wants to be more open, not less open, to the world as a whole. And it remains true that most EU citizens want to remain EU citizens, and that the EU is still a club that other countries like Montenegro want to join. Now, given that peace is not about to break out in the Middle East or in Africa, as Africa is not about to become as prosperous as Asia, I don't have a magic solution to the migration problem. But Europe's reaction cannot be and should not be to take refuge in barbed wire and to set one EU nation against another, nor should it bend over backwards to accommodate Mr. Erdogan's mix of megalomania and paranoia. The EU's commitment to a free press and an independent judiciary is not for bargaining. It follows then that our politicians, whether in Paris or in Prague, Athens or Berlin, they should actually be proud of what the EU has achieved. And they should say that. When the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012, it was, quotes, for over 6 decades having contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights in Europe. Now, one cynical and all too common reaction was to snigger, but we shouldn't snigger about this. Putting aside the awful and the bloody blemish of the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, it's a fact that the EU has kept the peace in Europe, as has NATO, of course. Europe's politicians could have underlined the EU's virtues, but instead, all too often, they use Brussels as a sort of convenient scapegoat for any unpopular domestic measure. Hence, the Brexit vote and the disillusion felt by so many citizens across Europe. So, my third suggestion, well, it's for our governments and our politicians to be realistic. The crisis of the Eurozone is proof that one size does not fit all. So why pretend that it does? The Brexit vote, the rise of populist parties in Central and Eastern Europe is proof that the European project cannot and should not impose a single structure that acts like a prison for member states with their own distinctive histories and characters. Instead, the EU needs more flexibility, as Mr. Lucic says, with various tiers of membership united by an adherence to the core values, which are democracy and freedom. What should all this mean for NATO? Well, I salute Montenegro's accession to the most successful military alliance the world has ever seen. But frankly, was it wise for Washington in the days of George W. Bush to dangle the carrot of NATO membership to Georgia and Ukraine? The need now is for NATO to lower the tensions with Russia. Given Mr. Putin's behavior, that is not going to be easy. As I said earlier, we're living in interesting times, and that may be very good for journalists like me, but sadly, it's not good for the rest of us. Thank you very much.